Hi guys, welcome to the second video on the nervous system. We're going to focus on the synapse and neurotransmitters. And you probably don't know what either one of those are yet, but they're going to be the most important part of our body. So much is going on in the synapse with neurotransmitters that it's unbelievable. So let's figure out exactly what that is. First of all, let me hit play show. Our essential question to recap: how can biology, hormones, neurotransmitters, and brain regions influence behavior and mental processes? So our mind is not some separate thing out there. It's rooted in our physical biology. So it's rooted in the chemicals, the nerve cells, the brain structures. So to understand moods and psychological disorders and all kinds of things, we need to know what's going on with the biology. All right, let's first start with what is the synapse. The synapse is the space between two neurons, the junction between the axon of the sending neuron and the dendrite of the receiving neuron. Sorry, there's a typo there, extra word. So when the electrical impulses are flowing through our brain, they're going from one neuron to the next. But the neurons don't actually touch each other. There's this tiny space. It's called the synapse or the synaptic cleft or the cleft. So this little image down here shows you how close the neuron gets to the receiving neuron. This is the sending neuron coming down, and this is the receiving neuron on the bottom. The electrical impulse or the action potential comes down this way. It's coming down the axon terminal. And there are these vesicles, little containers with chemicals called neurotransmitters. And the chemicals get released into the synapse. And these chemicals are super important, and there's all kinds of stuff going on in the synapse. Let's take another look at it. First of all, what's the definition of neurotransmitters? Chemicals released from sending neurons that travel across the synapse and bind to a receiving neurons. They can generate the action potential in the receiving neuron. So they can pass the electrical impulse on. So it's actually an electrical impulse traveling through our brain, but every time it gets to the synapse, there's a chemical messenger that has to send the electrical impulse on to the next neuron. So in this image, you can see the little green chemicals coming down, and they're binding to these receptor sites, and they have specific binding sites that they attach to. Each molecule does. All right, let's dig a little deeper. There's two types of neurotransmitters. Some are called excitatory, which cause neurons to fire. So if they cross the synapse and attach to another neuron, then that neuron will fire. And some are called inhibitory. They will attach and they will prevent the next neuron from firing. So some neurons get more firing in the brain. Some neurotransmitters get more firing in the brain. Some neurotransmitters slow down the electrical impulses in the brain. Okay, let me give you a couple of examples. One neurotransmitter is called serotonin. It's involved with mood regulation. So it's linked to depression. If you don't have enough serotonin, people who are depressed usually have low levels of serotonin. So there's a link there. And there's some medicines I'll talk about later that can help with that. Another neurotransmitter is called dopamine. Dopamine is involved in some disorders like schizophrenia and Parkinson's. So if there's too much dopamine in the synapse, that could lead to Parkinson's disease, where you have tremors. And if there's not enough, it could lead to schizophrenia. So that is dopamine. Okay, here's a list of other here's a list of other ones. Okay, sorry, spaced out there for a second. I was reading it. Okay, we need to know these neurotransmitters for the AP test. There's always going to be a couple of questions on it, so let's get into them. ACH, or acetylcholine, enables muscle action. It's linked to Alzheimer's. So if you don't have enough ACH, it's linked to Alzheimer's. You can remember that because of the A in acetylcholine and the A in the Alzheimer's. They're linked. Dopamine and serotonin I just mentioned. Norepinephrine is another one. It controls alertness and arousal. Undersupply is also linked to depression. GABA is a inhibitory neurotransmitter. So if you don't have enough GABA, it's linked to seizures, tremors, and insomnia. These are all things where you're overexcited, like seizures is too much firing of neurons in the brain. Tremors is too much firing, you can't stop the movement. And insomnia is when you can't sleep, you're too alert. Glutamate is the final one we need to know. It's an excitatory neurotransmitter involved in memory. The oversupply can stimulate the brain and cause migraines or seizures. So I hope you're getting the picture when I said at the beginning of the screencast that what's going on in the synapse is really having a lot of effect on how you're functioning. I think it's so fascinating. It's so important of all the things that are going on there. A lot of medicines people take imitate the neurotransmitters. And so we're going to look at some ways that medicines get into the synapse and they do their thing, because a lot of medicines are really helping a lot of people out, and it's in the synapse that they're doing their magic. So one type of substance or medication could be called an agonist. An agonist can get into the synapse and it can mimic or imitate a neurotransmitter. So their molecular structure is very similar to a neurotransmitter. It can get in there and it can bind to the receptor site. And for instance, heroin, or in this slide it says morphine. Morphine, heroin, and codeine are all opiates, drugs that come from opium, the opium plant, the poppy plant. Did you know poppy seeds? If you ever get a poppy seed muffin, those little seeds, that's the same plant that creates opium and heroin. So if you use heroin or morphine, it gets into your synapse and it imitates a neurotransmitter called an endorphin. And endorphins make you feel good. We should add that to our list. I think it's on the notes. Endorphins make you feel good. It's your body's natural way of feeling good. And so heroin imitates that, and it makes you feel really good. This is why people get addicted to heroin. One problem with opiates, heroin included, is that when you stop taking them, your body doesn't produce endorphins right away. And so your body doesn't have any natural way of making you feel good. So people who try to quit heroin, it's a very painful experience for them because their body doesn't naturally produce endorphins. It takes a while for that to come back. Okay, there's another thing in the synapse called an antagonist. An antagonist is like you learn in English class. There's the protagonist, and then there's the antagonist of the story who tries to block the protagonist from reaching his goals. So an antagonist blocks a neurotransmitter from doing its job. So an example of that, there's some poisons. There's one called Curare that paralyzes its victims by blocking the acetylcholine receptors involved in muscle movement. So that's an antagonist. So we have agonist in the synapse, antagonist in the synapse, and there's also something called reuptake. And reuptake is going to be important for people who experience depression. When neurotransmitters release, or when an axon terminal releases neurotransmitters into the synapse, after a bunch of them bind to the receiving neuron, it sucks the rest back up in a process. It's called reuptake, the reabsorption of the neurotransmitters. So if that didn't happen, then the neurons would just keep going and keep firing the second neuron. So that puts the brakes on neurotransmitter action. So people who are depressed, I mentioned it's linked to serotonin. If there's not enough serotonin in the synapse, researchers and pharmaceutical companies have developed drugs that are called SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And they get into the synapse and serotonin is released, and then the SSRIs block the reuptake of the serotonin so it doesn't get reabsorbed. So it stays in the synapse and it sends more messages onto the receiving neuron. So an example of that type of drug is Prozac, and there's several other antidepressants that do the same thing. Okay, that's it for today's lesson. There will be more to come in the future on the brain. See me if you have any questions or email me.